London is a city that breathes history. Its streets are a mosaic of memories where every stone seems to tell a different story. But something has changed over the years. If you could go back in time and walk along the sidewalks of London in the 1960s, 1970s, or 1980s, you would find a city quite different from the one we know today. A simpler city, more human, more connected to its essence. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but there was a genuine magic in its imperfections. Today, as we walk through its modern, shiny streets, we often feel nostalgic for what once was. In the 1960s, London was at the height of a cultural revolution. It was the era of swinging London, when Carnaby Street dictated fashion trends and the Beatles dominated the airwaves. But beyond the glamour and effervescence, there was a simplicity that now seems almost unbelievable. Imagine walking through Soho on a cold autumn morning. The streets were filled with small family-owned shops, where shopkeepers knew their customers by name. Pubs were gathering spots for everyone, from labourers to emerging artists. Conversations flowed naturally, without the rush that defines our interactions today. Street markets like Covent Garden were still authentic. They weren't just places to buy fresh fruits and vegetables, but also community spaces where neighbours exchanged stories while picking out their groceries. Children played in the streets without fear, while adults chatted on street corners. It was a time when the pace of life was slower, more human. You could feel the pulse of change in the air, but there was still room for traditions and personal connections. It was a unique blend of old and new, deep roots and high aspirations. The 1970s brought global challenges that hit London deeply. The oil crisis, runaway inflation and social conflicts left visible marks on the city. However, even amid these difficulties, London maintained its peculiar charm. It was a time when people gathered in pubs to discuss politics, music and everyday problems. Crackling fireplaces and worn wooden tables offered refuge from both the economic and social cold. Neighbourhoods still had their own identities, shaped by local residents. Camberwell, Brixton and Islington were not just names on a map, they were living communities, each with its own stories and cultures. Music was the city's beating heart. Bands like The Clash and Sex Pistols emerged from industrial suburbs, giving voice to a dissatisfied generation. But at the same time, there was a sense of belonging. People came together around common causes, whether protesting inequality or celebrating the cultural diversity that was beginning to flourish. The streets of London in the 1970s were less polished but more authentic. The weathered facades of buildings told stories of decades of use. Graffiti on the walls wasn't commercialized, art but genuine expressions of rebellion and creativity. There was a raw, honest beauty in the city that seems to have been swept away by gentrification. In the 1980s, London faced new challenges, but also experienced moments of renewal. It was an era of stark contrasts. On one hand, the city struggled with unemployment, budget cuts, and social conflicts like the miners' strike. On the other, there was an electric energy in the air, driven by music, fashion, and pop culture. The East End, for example, was a stronghold of workers and immigrants, where life was tough but full of human warmth. The Victorian houses, though worn, were home to families building their lives with resilience. Street markets still held on, selling affordable goods for those who needed to save every penny. But the decade also saw the emergence of a new London. Docklands began to be revitalized, and skyscrapers started to rise on the horizon. While this represented progress, it also signaled the beginning of the end of a certain urban simplicity. Small businesses began to give way to large chains, and neighborhoods started to lose some of their local identity. Even so, in the 1980s, London was still a city where people met on the streets, in parks and in pubs. It was a place where life happened outside of digital screens, where connections were made face to face, and where the city seemed to belong to everyone, not just the privileged. Today, London is a global city, a metropolis that attracts millions of tourists and workers from all over the world. Its gleaming skyscrapers, luxury stores, and stylish cafes are testaments to impressive progress. But at the same time, something has been lost along the way. The small family-owned shops that gave personality to neighborhoods have been replaced by international franchises. Street markets, once community spaces, are now expensive tourist destinations. Traditional pubs, which were the heart of social life, are rapidly disappearing, victims of high rents and changing social habits. The city has also become more unequal. While some thrive in newly gentrified neighborhoods, others struggle to survive. In an unforgiving real estate market, the cost of living has skyrocketed, and many native Londoners have been forced to leave the city they called home. However, there are signs of hope. Community movements are trying to preserve London's soul, transforming old warehouses into art galleries and creating accessible public spaces. But it's hard not to feel nostalgic for the past, when the city seemed more accessible, more human, more connected. London has changed, and it will change even more in the future. It's a city that never stops evolving, reinventing itself. But as we look at old photographs and hear the stories of those who lived there in the past, we realize that something special has been lost along the way. Perhaps it's the simplicity of human interactions, the sense of belonging, or the authenticity of the streets. Perhaps it's the idea that London, despite all its contradictions, was a city that belonged to all its inhabitants, not just the rich or powerful. Today, as we walk through its modern streets, we might ask ourselves, is it still possible to recover some of that magic? Can we find a balance between progress and preservation, between innovation and tradition? Perhaps the answer lies in valuing what remains of the past and fighting to keep London's soul alive, even amidst the changes, because in the end, what makes a city special isn't its buildings or economy, but the people who live there and the stories they share. And as long as there are Londoners willing to remember and celebrate what once was, there will always be hope that the true essence of London will never be completely lost.